Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining me today. I'm gonna this talk is all about the work that we do at Winder.ai. We're an AI consultancy and we provide development and consulting services for AI applications and businesses looking to improve their AI maturity and implement things such as MLOps. And that's the topic of the discussion today. I'm going to be talking about some work we did for a governmental body in the UK, a regulatory body in the UK called Ofcom, who have been charged with the remit of policing the new online safety bill. So I'm going to talk a lot about that. Just before we get started, a bit of admin. If you're interested in anything I'm talking about today, then please visit Winder.ai. All the information's there. And if you have any questions, then you can use the chat functionality in the social media application of your choice. So if you're on LinkedIn, you can just use the chat window there and I should be able to see the messages. Okay, so yeah, this is a presentation that I've been working on to talk about the work we did with Ofcom. And it's all about online safety and specifically how AI is used and operated to improve online safety. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need online safety, what the online safety bill is and what it intends to do. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the work that we did investigating some of the use cases and the implementation details of how large and small social media platforms use AI to keep people safe. All right, let's crack on. So I'm going to try my best to try and steer away from clickbaity like articles from a certain person. But obviously it's been in the news at the moment that online safety is really at the forefront of all of the discussions, and it's always in relation to free speech. There's a lot of people out there that believe in free speech, and they use that as a reason for opening up and allowing people to effectively do what they want. So there's lots of stories that have been in the news of a certain individual who is going to, try and open up the internet by providing a place where people can talk open and freely. So a lot of the discussions that we're going to talk about today, there's parallels really between the idea of free speech and freedom of expression and online safety, and those two worlds need to come together in order to find a solution. And the main reason for that is that there's no real thing as free speech. No, you aren't able legally to say what you like. If there are laws in place that attempt to keep people safe effectively, and in the UK at least, the main law that does that is Human Rights Act of 1998. And that was borrowed from the EU European Convention. And actually, interestingly, prior to that, there was nothing in English law that actually gives people the right to freedom of expression. And the most important bit of this law is that everyone has the right to freedom of expression, but it is subject to conditions. And I've highlighted this section here in the law. Subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties that are prescribed by law. So basically, that line in there is saying that you're allowed to say what you want, as long as it's legal. If there's something in that is illegal, then you're not allowed to say it. Okay, so fundamental misunderstanding about people talking about free speech is that you can say what you want. You can't. And what that does is that it opens the door to other laws, basically. And so whenever a case like this does go to trial, it always involves other laws, because the freedom of expression is provided to all people, but within the remit of all of the laws. So you have to look at all of the laws, and there are lots of laws that potentially define what could be described as harm. So one of the most important one is the Public Order Act of 1986. A person is guilty of an offence if they use threatening or abusive words or behaviour or disorderly behaviour, or displays any writing, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening. So basically it's saying that you can say what you want, but you're not allowed to be abusive. And I think that is a decent premise, and I think most people would agree with that. But to just demonstrate on how complicated this subject can be, it doesn't just mean like recent laws, it means like historical laws as well. I found a reference to a law called the Justices of the Peace Act 1361. Yes, that's the year that this law was passed. I'm sure it's not relevant today, but I could imagine a situation where it might be. And you know, this image on the right is actually a picture of that law printed. I don't know if you can see it, printed in 1707. So this this book, this image of that law on the right hand side is still 500 years, you know, 400 years older than when the law was originally passed. And actually, like the law itself, it contains language that doesn't even make sense anymore. So basically, it prevents riotous and barbarous behavior that disturbs the peace of the king. Barbarous, I had to Google that because I'd never heard of that before, and it turns out it's not even in the dictionary anymore. It's a legal term that is sometimes used, but I don't think it means the same thing that it did then. I assume it means like riotous behavior rather than like what the legal definition of that word. So literally the words inside these laws don't exist anymore. So I'm not sure how they could be applied. But the point is that freedom of expression, freedom of speech exists only within the confines of all other laws. Okay. So when we bring it back to social media platforms have a responsibility to attempt to uphold that law in you know, to a to be defined level. We don't quite know at what level they do need to police it, but there has to be a responsibility there. And you know, going back to the previous stories about Twitter, there's been lots of talk about the number of people that have been fired recently. And prior to a few months ago, there were about 7,500 employees at Twitter. There's now approximately 2,500. You know, so 5,000 people left Twitter. And people are rightly saying, well, what's happened to the moderation teams there? So they've been trying quite hard to show that they are still trying to maintain their moderation standards. But there's new stories coming out, like the one on the right, that, you know, Twitter being sued for whatever. And I mean, it's obviously a really difficult job for them. Moderating speech and thoughts and ideas on the internet all over the world is an inherently difficult problem. Like we can go into all sorts of discussions about the definitions of things, but like one of the most obvious ramifications is that if you're trying to police this, you have to police it according to each of the country's laws, and each country is different. They have their own laws. So for example, in Germany, it is illegal to deny that the Holocaust happened. Like, it's literally illegal. You can get a you can go to court for it. So if anybody is found to be doing that, then they could come under police enforcement action. In the UK, I'm pretty sure it's not illegal to. I'm pretty sure it is legal to say that, or although you could fall under some of those laws that I mentioned earlier about causing causing harm. And the watershed moment for all of this was in 2017. There was a young girl that committed suicide when she was 14, and it's been ongoing for years, like rightly so. They've published a coroner's inquest, basically into what had happened, and it was found that she was regularly browsing anonymously and posting anonymously on social media networks about committing suicide, and she viewed content about committing suicide, and she spoke about it at length, and and then it happened, and since then, that's kind of the watershed moment that made people. It took a death to make people start thinking about what if that was my child? What do we need to do? And now, thankfully, people are starting to take it seriously, and that this really is why the online safety bill exists. But it's not just social media. I think that this idea extends to other parts of life. My wife's a teacher, and she's been through a couple of Ofsted inspections. And if you're not familiar, Ofsted is the government body that is responsible for auditing schools, auditing the curriculum and auditing the performance of schools. And Ofsted have a process where after a random amount of time, they give a school a call a day before they're about to turn up, and then they spend a couple of days at that school investigating how that school does their teaching. And it's been criticized for a long time because it's a horrible, it's an ultimately stressful time. And one of the main reasons for that is that if you have a track record of being at a school that goes from being good to being bad, if you've presided over that school at that time, that record stays with you forever. And that has, consequences in subsequent jobs. A bit like the Financial Conduct Authority's regulation with finance in the UK. If you are a company director and you are accountable to the FCA, if you're found to be doing something wrong, then they can basically put you on a blacklist to prevent you from getting a job in the future. It's not quite as bad as that here, but it's a similar level of stress. No head teacher wants to go from an amazing school down to an inadequate school. And reading more and more about this story, and the story is, sorry, I didn't even mention, the story is that Ofsted came in, they did their inspection. It didn't go well for whatever reason. And then the head teacher committed suicide because of what she saw what she perceived to be the outcome of the report. And the more you read into it, the worse it gets. So the feedback from eyewitness accounts are saying that silly things happened, silly school things happened that caused the inspectors to extrapolate in a way that doesn't seem reasonable. So there was a boy doing a dance move akin to the flossing, which is something that young boys like to do, and they tried to say that was evidence of the sexualization of children at school. Like it's obviously taking it too far. And the icing on the cake here for me was that actually in the Ofsted report that you can view online. So if you lived in that area and you wanted your child to go to this school, you could read this report. The link's right there actually. And halfway down the report, there's this little section. There has been a change of leadership at the school following the death of a head teacher who was in post at the time of the inspection. Like she committed suicide because of this action, and then they have the audacity to then write this down in a report to say it happened. It's shocking. It's shocking, and this is not the first time it's happened. Here's two other people that have committed suicide in the past that have gone through a similar process. And this is a government organization. This is Ofsted. This is Ofcom's, sister. So I think that the words that people use have an effect, and therefore it is important to put protections in place to protect people from this ever happening. It shouldn't happen, especially in government. And so that's why I believe so strongly in the online safety bill, because it really is one of the first pieces of legislation that attempts to tackle this really tricky situation of, like, how can we attempt to police this? How can we attempt to start to draw the line of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable? And that is actually the essence of what this bill is. It's the attempt at a compromise between what is acceptable and what is not. And there's been a lot of pushback actually from social media platforms and people that would be implementing this bill technologically, that the definition of these things are quite hard to come by. And I totally get that. I totally appreciate that. But we already have law in place to define what is illegal, and therefore that's a really good start. So the online safety bill, in a nutshell, is a new bill that mandates that platforms need to remove all illegal content. That's like headline number one. They need to remove content that is banned by their own terms and conditions. That's fine. They've got their own policies that they can adhere to. And finally, empower adults and children to basically tailor what they want to see. And I think all of those three sort of key considerations are absolutely reasonable. And the illegal content, the definition of illegal content that comes from prior law is quite obvious: child sexual abuse, extreme sexual violence, fraud, hate crime, inciting violence, so on and so forth. These things, they already have a precedent in law. This bill is just asking platforms to implement that law. Okay, there are exceptions, there are limits. You know, it's not going to apply to everybody. It'll have different applicabilities to like the large social media platforms versus the small ones. But I think, you know, the general idea is sound. And the ramifications of not doing that are also similarly serious. We've got, you know, big fines, 18 million or 10%, similar to the GDPR legislation. But this is an interesting one. And this is one that is not currently settled. Criminal action will be taken against senior managers. So that's a big difference between this law and GDPR. In GDPR, yes, the company can get fined by a lot of money, but nobody is criminally held accountable for what happens. This places criminal liabilities on specific individuals. So I think if that does stay in, then I think that will force companies to put these things in place, because somebody at the top is going to be criminally responsible for that. And Ofcom will have the power to be able to effectively stop that platform from doing business. And it doesn't just apply to UK-based businesses, it applies to businesses across the world who are accessible to UK users. So companies will have a choice as to whether they want to shut down their service and not offer it to UK customers, or abide by the law. So just to give you a bit of insight into the challenges here, these are some numbers that I pulled from the social media websites. This is the amount of content that was pulled down in 6 months, in 6-month periods for Facebook and Twitter. You'll note a distinct lack of information for Twitter for the last year, basically. We can speculate as to why that is, but you can see that Facebook are dealing with a huge amount of data. If we were to add all of this up, then sorry. I haven't added this little bit of detail. These numbers pertain to the removals of content that's specifically related to online harm, to suicide related posts. So these are the number of posts that have been removed in that time period that specifically incite suicide, talk about suicide, you know, things like that. If we look over all categories that are currently deemed as worthy of being taken down by their own terms and conditions at the moment, not by any legal standards, then between July and December of 22, Facebook removed 6.4 billion pieces of content. So that's 403 removals every single second. So every single second, there's 403 pieces of content that violate the terms and conditions of Facebook. That's a huge amount of data. And obviously, you can't do that manually. You can't have a person or even a million people look at every single piece of content to review it manually. So what's the solution? AI, of course, we're an AI company. Of course, we're going to push AI. And so what we did was we worked with Ofcom to investigate the use of AI, and specifically the operational aspects. So not the modeling techniques or the use cases, but specifically how these companies are managing and operating their AI to deal with this scale. Because it is literally the only way that you can deal with this scale. It's not possible for a large social media company to do this in any other way. So therefore, it's important that regulators understand the underlying concepts and also the thought processes and the designs, and all of the operational aspects that go into operating AI at scale. So what is MLOps? MLOps is a collection of processes and technical best practices. A lot of people try to tell you it's a tool or it's a suite of tools, or if you specifically implement some technology in this way and that way and connect it together like that, then it is MLOps. It's not. MLOps is a general idea that follows from DevOps. It tries to empower data scientists and engineers to deploy quicker and deploy safely. So it's a whole combination of different sort of implementation details, which I've kind of highlighted a little bit on the left, but you can probably add to that list. If you're interested in finding out more, then you can check out the website. And I've just noticed the logo is right over the top of that QR code, so that is not helpful at all. There you go. I'll just hide that. That'll link to the page that talks a bit more about what MLOps is and how it can help you. And specifically with this project, what we were trying to do with a typo in the title there was we were trying to answer these three questions. How do platforms build these auto moderation tools? What techniques, tools, and technologies and hardware actually are these platforms using? What processes do businesses use to manage the development and the operation of these tools? So we interviewed a wide range of companies, from large social media platforms to small social media, well, social platforms. Sometimes there's no media involved in these platforms. We spoke to platforms that are in specific genres. For example, we spoke to some adult platforms, which was particularly interesting. We spoke to some third-party moderation product vendors. They had some good insights as well, and industry experts. And based upon all of that information, we helped Ofcom understand the end-to-end development process, and we were able to publish a final anonymized public report. So let me just briefly go over some of the general findings that we found. This is kind of a bit more of the technical part of the talk, so apologies if you're not technical. We tried to isolate specific parts of the MLOps or data science lifecycle. And so we started from one end, from the data end, and ended up at deployment. And then we started to look at all of the things that surround that, things like governance and costs and things like that. On the data side, we found that even small businesses were working with large amounts of data. It depended a little bit on what domain they were working in, what type of data they were working with. But even the small ones were working with large amounts of data. The data architecture was a really important foundation for all of them. Yeah, there's a lot of money that's been invested in the data architecture side of things. Larger businesses, and even to some extent, smaller businesses, have built bespoke data platforms to work on this data. And quite a lot of them have been open sourced. Improving data quality and through monitoring and testing was like a really big focus at the moment. And also we came across some really, really complicated annotation schemes. So annotation is the process of labeling data. So giving raw data the correct answer. So humans will come in, or experts will come in, and they will say what the right answer is. That was really interesting, especially when you get to things that change over time. Annotating, when we spoke to platforms that dealt with video data a lot, annotating video data is particularly tricky, because not only are you doing like object-like detection, you're also sort of doing contextual detection over time as well. So you have to annotate things over time as well as within frames. But actually, one thing that was a little bit surprising to us was that people had a limited amount of observability over their sort of metadata, their lineage, their provenance, their metadata systems around that were supporting the data architecture. So I think that's an area that they need to improve upon. When we move into the development part of the life cycle, they're using a wide range of modeling techniques, but they tended to stick towards institutionally known models. So an individual business would commonly pick like a one or a small set of models that they would use for most of their problems. And that makes sense, because if you've got experience using a particular type of model, then you know what its pros and cons are. A significant amount of the development time was spent working on the data, not the models, especially at some of the larger platforms. The larger platforms are at the point now where the training and retraining and deployment processes, they're all so automated. The only or the most manual part of the problem is finding and choosing the best data in which to use for this particular model. And also, which was really interesting, the evaluation of those models is moving into production, moving towards production. A lot of companies were testing in production. So, developing a product, shadowing in production, or streaming a very small subset of data through this particular development instance of a model in order to do their development, which is quite fascinating. And then we've got in the deployment phase, this was probably one of the areas where there was a huge discrepancy between large and small platforms and vendors. The largest were using some very, very advanced deployment techniques, completely fully automated, a lot of robustness testing included in there. Smaller companies, less so. They're still doing a lot by hand. I think that's probably what you'd expect. Logging monitoring is used throughout, and the larger platforms in particular have invested heavily in data centers, in buying hardware and land to host their solutions. So this is, big stuff, big business. In the organization, the structures in the AI teams were quite distinct. So in larger companies, they had more structure and more distinct roles and responsibilities, whereas in smaller platforms, it tended to be more product focused, and individuals would probably do multiple roles. Again, probably makes sense, what you'd expect. Most platforms leverage third-party tools or data, but here's the I think that's pretty obvious as well. But here's the interesting part: a lot of the third-party vendors also consumed third-party vendors. So there is, if you're so inclined, there is a very interesting dependency chain, a very interesting digital supply chain that is emerging in this space, and it's purely related to the data. The supply chain of data is getting deeper every day. But there were also reports of the small to medium-sized companies that were sort of taking the first steps, and they were really struggling. It was taking them over a year, in one example, to integrate an AI solution from a third party. So it's not a simple undertaking. In terms of costs, AI teams are expensive. Yes, they are. And one platform suggested 10 million a year for their AI team. I can imagine that for the largest companies, that's small change. In terms of the third-party vendors, there was a variety of pricing structures. Some were volume-based, for more sort of commodity services. Some were annually priced, and the enterprise offerings were like bespoke custom jobs. The general challenges are probably the most interesting thing that came out of this. Actually, a lot of the third parties and the platforms were struggling with the definitions of what they should be trying to target. What is harm? I think there was a really great example from one discussion where, and it's just on my face because sorry, I've been looking at this wall of text for quite a long time. There was a really great example of an instance in India where apparently in India there is a law that prevents the Indian flag from being shown upside down. Is it upside down, or is it just not the right way up? Anyway, I think it might be upside down or something. So there's actually a law that makes it illegal to show the flag upside down. And so this particular company had to go to the effort of building an is the Indian flag upside down detector to prevent social media content being sent to India with flag upside down. So that's the level of like hyper localization that they're having to go to in order to try and solve some of the specific legalities in some of these jurisdictions. And so that's one aspect of the problem. The second one is like, where do you draw the line? Like, when does it become illegal? When does it become harm? There was a good example of examples where models can struggle when there is illegal content in an image, but it is masked or hidden by a piece of paper or a hand or whatever. And so, I mean, sort of feedback to the AI community, improving the performance of the contextual performance of models to be able to predict what is behind the hand or what is behind the card. It's an important problem that needs solving to help with that specific problem. What else have we got? And another thing that was quite interesting was the impacts of other laws. So obviously we've already got GDPR, and there are laws in place to give people the ability to appeal and request how their data is used. And as part of that, it comes data retention. So how long do you keep that data for? And what that has an impact. Some of the platforms we spoke to had quite short retention policies. One, due to laws like GDPR, but two, because there's just so much of it. Like, you need to get rid of it because you just run out of space. And so that placed a particular challenge in some parts of the MLOps life cycle where reproducibility is important. So one tenet of reliable machine learning is to be able to recreate the results that you have generated. So you need to be able to retrain upon the same data to get the same result. But the problem is you can't do that if you don't have the data anymore. So that was an interesting challenge. And there's a few more as well. We're running out of time, so I'll just go quickly. Another one that was really fascinating was some of this data is not only illegal to transmit, it's also illegal to store. And so you're not allowed to even look at some of this illegal data, but there are data scientists that are attempting to build models to detect it. So they're working entirely blind. They have to build some code to train a model, hand it off to a verified third party, usually law enforcement, the police, ask them to train it, give them back the results, and then they get a final performance figure and say, nope, that's rubbish, try again. They're working entirely in the dark, and I can only imagine how frustrating as a data scientist that must be. So lots of really interesting challenges that came out of this. There's a little bit more about governance and compliance as well. We're interested in that, and also companies are going to be more interested in this over time, because with all of this legislative action, companies need to know that they are compliant. And the only way to do that is through governance. The challenge that we had in particular is when we used the word governance, a lot of legal people were very interested in the questions we were asking, because governance is kind of thought to be like corporate governance. It's thought to be this legal issue that exists at a business level. And actually, no, we're interested in this in technical governance. It's like, what systems do you use to ensure that your models are doing what they should? What controls do you have in place? There's no legalese there. It's purely technical, but unfortunately, people were very reluctant to talk about it. So that needs to be improved. All right, so nearly there now. What's next? Well, in terms of the online safety bill, the bill itself has gone through the House of Commons. It's now in the House of Lords. If you're not aware, the UK has this crazy system where there's two levels of government. There's a Commons, which is the main sort of business of Parliament. Then there's the Lords, which is kind of responsible for like long-term planning and long-term views of things. They both have their points of view. The Lords are going to come back and say, no, we need to improve this. We need to improve this. And then there's one final big compromise before it gets royal assent. Yes, the king still needs to say that this bill is going to become law. Yeah, there's no sort of timeline on that because there really are some big question marks. You know, one of those is that criminal requirement. Are people going to be criminally responsible for things that are going to happen? Question mark over that. Also question marks over implementation as well. How far will companies have to go to actually implement the findings of these? So still some stuff to be worked out, but I'm sure that MLOps is going to have a huge role to play because of the technologies involved. You know, we need MLOps to help us manage and control and maintain these AI systems that are in use. And with that, I'll like to leave it there. If you're interested in doing more MLOps where you work, then that's something we specialize in. We provide consulting and development services around MLOps. So yeah, please reach out to us. And I'll just remove my face just for a moment so that you can get that link. So that's a link to the actual report, the actual final public report, which goes into a lot more detail. And it's some very good bedtime reading that will send you to sleep. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time. Okay, let's have a look to see if there's any questions. I'll just have a quick look over here. Right, I'll just give you a few minutes. I'll just go off camera to have a drink, and I'll just give you a few minutes to ask any questions if you've got any. Okay, I can't see any questions popping up, so we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you next time. See you later. Bye-bye.